This subject just goes right to the heart of whether or not those countries that have been polluting, who have been responsible for creating these dangerous conditions, understand that they also concomitantly have a responsibility to deal with the loss and the damage, and that climate reparations are important. And all across the planet, we have to come together to realize that we are all interconnected and we all have a responsibility for each other, especially those countries that are most powerful, those countries that are most responsible for the damage which is being created as we gather here in Glasgow and will be created in ever-increasing measure as each and every day, week, and month go by, unless we do something about it. So we stand here in Glasgow at the beating heart of the climate movement. Tens of thousands of activists, policymakers, advocates, and world leaders are gathered here to solve the moral, ecological, health, and justice crisis of our time, climate change. With all of us together, COP also stands for Climate's Our Priority. And I'm encouraged by this commitment. But today, I reiterate our call for urgent action. Aggressive action now can help prevent some of the worst outcomes of the climate crisis tomorrow. Outcomes that we know will fall most heavily on those who have done the least to cause this crisis. But we must also work to address the serious consequences of the crisis that people around the world are facing right now, every single day of their lives. The climate crisis is already attacking our health, our infrastructure, our homes, our businesses, and our communities. This crisis is interconnected and international. But with bold, intersectional, real solutions and real funding, we can seize this moment to create a safer and a more just world. We cannot afford inaction. We cannot afford business as usual. We need robust climate action. We need economic justice for those harmed by the climate crisis and by our fossil fuel addiction, and we need it now. Earlier this year, a report from one of the world's largest insurance providers, Swiss Re, found that the effects of climate change could cause as much as $23 trillion in losses if we do not address the climate crisis. Trillions of dollars lost from the damage and chaos of the climate crisis. Trillions of dollars that, if we instead choose to act, could be put toward climate resilience and disaster remediation to help communities survive. Trillions of dollars that could be used to address this crisis for years to come. Now, I'm proud that President Biden has doubled the United States commitment to climate change aid around the world. The United States now aims to invest $11.4 billion by 2024 to help developing countries around the world address the climate crisis. But our work does not end there. Our responsibility does not end there. These extreme weather events, drought, famine, disease, and rising sea levels are driving people from their homes in every corner of the world. They are destroying lives, destroying cultures, destroying the idea of a survivable future for far too many. The climate crisis is a humanitarian crisis. The United States has been the leader historically in fossil fuel emissions. 40% of the excess CO2 in the atmosphere is red, white, and blue from the United States. We have a moral responsibility to respond to the harm which we are doing for those who are most affected. And we have within our hands the power to help those who are most in need. Because ultimately, these storms are destroying lives, destroying cultures, destroying the idea of a survivable future for far too many. The climate crisis is a humanitarian crisis. The United States is absolutely responsible for a huge part of what we see on the nightly news, telling us of these storms, of these floods, of these fires, of these catastrophes all around the world. And now the United States must be a leader in delivering funding, providing financing, and ensuring that we have a true humanitarian response in place so that those who are unavoidably affected by this crisis have help, which we provide to them. I have introduced legislation in the United States Senate to create a humanitarian program for climate-displaced people that will provide climate refugees with the protections and the aid which they need. But we know that resettlement should be a last resort. No one should be driven from their home, their family, or their culture. No one should be forced to uproot their lives due to global climate catastrophe. And I have fought to ensure that the United States will take on the responsibility of climate change adaptation, global disaster risk reduction, resiliency building, and disaster response and recovery. As the crisis accelerates, we have to move beyond the traditional models and structures of international security assistance. Investing in resilience now is our best hope to protect people abroad from the effects of the climate crisis, a crisis for which the United States bears an historically disproportionate responsibility. Because the losses and damages we face are not just dollar signs, they are human life. And no one is immune from this global scourge. There are children in Texas who froze to death this year. There are children in Brazil who are dying from the heat. There are babies who drowned, not just in the United States, but around the world, literally drowned to death in India, in Nepal, and in the United States this year. There are families across the world right now who are hoping and praying that we will do the right thing today. We must recommit to bold and robust action on a global scale to address the national security, economic, environmental, and moral crises of our time. We need to fund clean energy and adaptation measures. We need to fund our communities' climate resilience, not pay for more pollution. We need to provide reparations for communities that have been devastated by climate disasters. And we need to bring long overdue justice to the countries and communities that have faced the worst burdens of our global fossil fuel addiction. This is the mission before us. This is the subject that COP26 should be talking about. This is what everyone should understand as the moral responsibility of those who have power, because those who do not have power are the ones who are going to suffer. Those who are most vulnerable are the ones who are going to suffer. And this gathering from across the whole planet has to focus on that central reality, that we who have benefited from fossil fuels are going to transfer the worst burdens to the poorest of our global society. This is the mission before us. I stand in solidarity with you, and I look forward to working with all of my partners here today to make that vision a reality. Thank you for adding the moral core to what is going on in Glasgow this week. Thank you all so much.
Thank you. Thank you very much, Senator. That really grounded us in like why we're here and what we're doing. I really, really appreciate that. The Senator unfortunately has to leave, but we really appreciate you coming. Jacob Johns, who's over there, is gonna hop on the stage and sit right next to me, which will be great. Excellent. So now that we'll transition, so I want to talk a little bit about loss and damage and kind of the history of the United States and the context that we're in the negotiations. So the reason that U.S. Climate Action Network specifically wanted to have a conversation about this is because the U.S. has not been particularly good on dealing with loss and damage. The Senator just pointed out incredible examples of how people are losing their culture, people are losing their lives, and people are hurting generally from climate change because we missed adaptation, and now people are just getting impacted, basically. And so we're at this point of time where we need our country to start to actually provide financial support to those who are being impacted by climate change. Luckily, they've started like really engaging and trying to support the Santiago network, but we need to go a step forward because this is a humanitarian crisis, and the Senator laid it out quite well. So I'm going to have Kathy and Jacob introduce themselves. I'll start with Kathy first. And we'll go from there and just kind of talking about like what this moment means. And I just want to call your attention to the title. When we're talking about loss and damage, we are talking about this moral responsibility, and it is a call for climate reparations because these countries, many of them have been systematically oppressed and colonized for hundreds and hundreds of years. And now they are at a point in development where they are behind other countries, and it's not fair. And so what we want to do is make sure that the U.S. is doing their fair share on this work. So Kathy, if you wouldn't mind introducing yourself and giving us a little bit of your perspective on the issue.
Thank you, Natalie. Good afternoon. I'm Catherine Eglin, and I chair the Environmental and Climate Justice Committee for the NAACP National Board of Directors. I am also the co-founder for the Education, Economics, Environmental, Climate, and Health Organization, a Gulf region-based organization. We want to talk about loss and damage today because safeguarding people and nature from the impacts of climate change requires collective action from all countries and stakeholders. And in this regard, the Warsaw International Mechanism on Loss and Damage must also escalate the importance of anchoring loss and damage in enhanced NDCs. We're at a pivotal moment. We need to unite to address the climate crisis, and to avert and minimize further loss and damage, we must act now. But we have a need to address loss and damage domestically as well. I was glad to hear the Senator actually talk about this from a global as well as a national perspective, because that tells me that he really gets it. Unlike most politicians, he really has a handle and a good understanding on this. It has created food scarcity, caused climate migration, which leads to instability and civil unrest. Loss and damage has contributed to disease outbreak. Innocent children are hungry and starving to death. Yet we're playing politics with their precious lives. Parties are shrugging off their responsibilities and telling innocent nations, innocent people, innocent children to get insurance. Well, I know personally all too well the ravages of climate change. I've had my home practically destroyed to a fierce storm. Yes, I had insurance, but it also took an enormous amount of our personal savings to cover the gaps of what the insurance didn't pay. And yes, I was able to rebuild my home. But let me tell you about the ultimate human cost. I lost two of my dearest friends to drowning death when the rapid waters of Hurricane Katrina came rushing into their home. Even climbing into their attic could not save them. Insurance does not cover the loss of your friends and family. When we look at loss and damage through the lens of equity and a just transition, it's absolutely critical that we consider the necessity of having loss and damage included in the national climate plans. We need accountability. It's essential that we push for developed countries to include finance for loss and damage in their NDCs. If we are to adequately and effectively address climate change with a sense of urgency and from an equity and human rights perspective, we have a moral obligation to address harms posed by loss and damage to nations and communities of low wealth. These are the nations and communities that have contributed least to climate change, but through no fault of their own have been impacted most. Developing countries that have suffered considerable loss and damage will not meet its climate's goal without finance. Likewise, when we look at loss and damage domestically, especially in the climate vulnerable regions that we have developing communities that continue to be unable to adequately prepare, adapt, mitigate, and recover from climate disasters. The issue of loss and damage finance is not as complicated or as controversial as it's made out to be. When policymakers want to bury their heads in the sand and ignore their responsibilities and obligations, their first defense is to claim that the issue is too complicated. It is not complicated and not controversial because developed countries simply don't want to take the responsibility and ownership of loss and damage. Plain and simply, from a global perspective, we will not meet our 1.5C target without finance for loss and damage. And our vulnerable communities, especially in vulnerable regions who have suffered disproportionate loss and damage, will continue to lack the ability to fully recover from escalating climate perils. We must acknowledge vulnerable populations that live on the front lines of climate injustices across the fence lines of toxic environmental injustices and on the sidelines of economic prosperity. Thank you.
Thank you, Kathy. I really appreciate the clear calls to action there and looking for finance and doing what we need to as the United States in global solidarity. Jacob, can you introduce yourself and maybe talk a little bit more about what this global solidarity means and what you as an Indigenous US citizen, how your community may have experienced loss and damages and like how you identify with other groups?
Yeah, my name is Jacob Johns. I'm a community-supported organizer based out of Spokane, Washington, in Washington State in the U.S. I am Hopi and Anakimerotum from Arizona. I think, as an Indigenous person living within the U.S., we're already living in this post-apocalyptic world. Colonization has made our old way of life impossible to manage. And, with the colonization of North American continent, we saw, consumerism start the industrial revolution. And, thinking about the impacts that colonization and capitalism has had on the planet, it's important for us to really own up to that as we slowly start to evolve as human beings. It's important for us to hold into memory what has made this one of the wealthiest nations on the planet. The U.S. is what I'm referring to. And when we think about that, that this wealth has been built off of the blood, sweat, and tears of Indigenous and Black people who were brought into slavery. And this is what has made America great, apparently. And when we start thinking about that within our own context in the U.S., that we need to stay below 1.5 because bad things would happen to the Northern Hemisphere. Well, bad things are already happening to the Southern Hemisphere. And a lot of those people who have the voices that are being impacted by this climate catastrophe are being excluded from this COP. There's not equality, there is not significant voices from the global South to really advocate for what's happening within their own communities now. This isn't a far off experience for a lot of communities in third world and island nations. This is something that's happening now. These unpredictable weather patterns, this fluctuation of heat and cold, all of these things are impeding the growth of crops, has led to the starvation of animals, which indigenous people, survive off of. When we talk about the destruction of the ecology, we talk about the destruction of life, of the natural world. And with that destruction, we need to somehow mitigate what's going to be happening. We need to be able to provide a way for these people to pull themselves out of the situation that we historically have put them in. When we talk about loss and damage from the U.S., as citizens of America, it's important for us to hold our elected officials accountable for the historical trauma that the U.S. has held across the entire world. This is not something brand new. This is us taking responsibility for the actions. And as a Native American, I too take responsibility, because now in the state of the world, I am an American citizen. And as I walk through these halls, people don't see me as an Indigenous person. They see me as an American. And now as we've rejoined the Paris Accords, it's important for us as American citizens to stand in solidarity with Indigenous communities and other smaller nations who are suffering at the hands of this impending climate collapse that we are just now starting to feel the effects of in the U.S. This is a major thing that is affecting a lot of poor countries that we have an impact to go into and help mitigate the circumstances that we've put them in, but more importantly, take precautions to prevent future catastrophes from happening. And we have the will, we have the money, we have the technology. All we need is the will. And it is our responsibility as civil society to speak up for those voices that need amplification. When we talk to our negotiating team, it's important for us to bring up the facts of what America has contributed to the greenhouse gas emissions globally. We're not talking about something far off, we're talking about something now. And so it's important for us to stand in solidarity with our brothers and sisters who might be on different continents and different countries and different planes of existence. We are human beings and we share the same planet. We breathe the same air and drink the same water. We only have each other to stand with each other. We only have each other to stand in solidarity. And so as civil society tries to connect here and our negotiating teams are out there doing their things, it's important for us to really press the issue and speak up for those, because we have a social and moral obligation as first world citizens to speak up for the global south and those folks who have life or death situations hanging on the votes of our negotiating team. Thank you.
Thank you, Jacob. Thank you very much. I really appreciate the context of where the U.S. sits in the discussion of everything and what our responsibilities are. I'm going to now turn over to Miriam, and she is with CAN Uganda. And I wanted to talk a little, have you share your perspective on loss and damage, where you see it now in the negotiations, where you've seen hope and where you could see opportunity, and how this conversation has affected people from your country as well.
Yeah, thank you very.
Yeah, you're good.
Yeah, thank you very much, Natalie, the moderator. As introduced, I come from Uganda, and coming to this space, I come to this space, a space where climate change is looked at or even defined from various perspectives. This context, this space speaks about climate change with a lot of complications. To some extent, that is not usually connected to by the people where I stay, the communities I come from. And for that reason, I'll choose for this conversation to speak about loss and damage and climate change the way I know it, the way we know it. Climate change has been defined as cross-cutting, and indeed, it's cross-cutting. And to put it even more graphic about where I come from, or in the context of where I come from, it affects communities not as a whole or as a blanket. it affects people in the communities differently. As children, they can no longer have the requisite nutrition to cater for their growth. When we have extreme events, for example, droughts and mudslides and floods, they have a long chain of effects, extra effects that happen along with them. It speaks to, it results into children not being able to have food, children having climate-triggered diseases. Malaria is a one number killer, is a biggest killer amongst children in my community. And the idea of climate change even exacerbates it. How? Because of the changes in temperatures, the prevalence of mosquitoes that lead to malaria is very high, and malaria affects even more the children than any other group in my community. It has, I'll leave the issue of children at that. I'll talk about the women. Women who are looked at as caretakers. Traditionally, the issue of climate change and its effects, when it touches on food, it means that women are having extra burden because them as smallholder farmers taking care of their family's nutrition or household nutrition, they won't have food to take care of their families. And it brings about even extra challenges on the part of women. So if children cannot have food to eat, they will get sick. That's a burden, extra burden on women. If there's no food in the house, the men will migrate and go to other places, and that's an extra burden on women. If any person, anybody in the family gets sick, it's the women that take care. Now that's whatever comes with climate change and the effects of it puts extra burden on women. I'll talk about the young people, the youth. The youth, we recently have a current trend of anxiety triggered from information that we share publicly. So youth and children are they're not sure about their future. Everybody's talking about the world is about to end. And you know, the way we share that information is in such a way that it's not specified. So young people take it as a whole, and they take out depending on where they're coming from. So it's triggering a lot of anxiety, it's triggering a lot of uncertainty for the future, and it brings about trauma. So there are growing trends of trauma resulting as a result of youth and young children not being able to be sure about their future. Across the chain, we have the men that have their own issues. We have teachers, we have health workers that are overwhelmed by the increasing number of climate-triggered diseases. Now, the list goes on and on, but what I wanted to also underscore at this point is the additional burden that is being brought about by the double jeopardy triggered by COVID. Now, COVID-19, the pandemic, makes each and everything over and above and additional. And with that, I would like to state that while climate change has continuously and successfully and increasingly becoming a problem, we are at a junction and double jeopardy where COVID is also coming on board with its own challenges, over and above and additional, making it very difficult for communities, making it very difficult for systems at local level, local governance, making it very difficult for planning, making it very difficult to make decisions, because decisions not only at institutional level, but also decisions at personal level. At the moment, I can paint a picture of exactly what happened in my community during the COVID pandemic. It so happened that everyone was locked in, and therefore communities could not have alternatives for food, alternatives for which they could earlier on fend for themselves. Now they were locked in their own houses, dependent on the supplies, the small supplies by government, which was not sustainable. That pushed communities even closer and further to destructing their nearest natural resources, to the extent that they depended on it for food, for drugs, for everything that you can think about. And of course, that spells out so much in terms of what is it that we are doing. Are we really talking about, when we talk about reducing emissions, as taking care and sustainably managing our environments, shall we be able to move to the direction that we intend to be moving to? Shall we be able to achieve the goals that we have set out for ourselves to achieve? So things as they are happening, the issue of climate change coupled with COVID are really making life almost unbearable and unlivable. And that takes me to what I really would like to conclude my submission to, the issue of loss and damage, especially financing and capacity building for that. I think it's time that we began to look at things for the way they are, the way from the lenses and the eyes of the communities. Because at the end of the day, we need to look at things in two ways. One, these communities have really contributed and continue to contribute minimal levels and rates of emissions, contributing to global emissions, and yet they're most vulnerable. They're very vulnerable to the effects of climate change. So our priority should be addressing their adaptive challenges, but on top of adaptation, I think what should even be more priority is loss and damage, because before we even adapt, there are these challenges that are resulting out of a failure for mitigation, in our mitigation measure initiatives, and also adaptive initiatives. So loss and damage should be treated and should be given first priority if we're to talk about if we're talking about making sure that climate finances, available climate finance, and even that will be planned in the future will be put to meaningfulness. Thank you.
Thank you.
Yeah.
I'm really glad you mentioned the different population and who is affected. So in my role with Care About Climate, we also have a program called Empoderar Clima, which is about empowering young women for climate action. And as you may have seen, this is a co-event with the Women Environments Development Organization. So just to put a special pin in thinking about the gender lens and how this impacts loss and damage, because women tend to be more in charge of the household food. Women tend to be in charge of the water. Everything that you were saying, basically, they are helping manage. So I just wanted to give some information that was put together by the Women and Genders constituency. So over 80% of people currently displaced by climate-related events are women and girls, and this was cited by the UN. Women, especially across the global south, are hugely impacted due to structural inequalities they face, in part due to the prevalence of women's unpaid care and work. So when you're thinking about this, it's just, and how it all connects together, if women don't have a safety net through either money or through being able to get a job, and then their homes get destroyed or they are hurt by disease, they are the ones who suffer most. And so really I think today we're really wanting to make sure that like loss and damage becomes a permanent agenda item under the COP, so that we can actually make sure that it gets addressed every single time. And then parties must agree on sufficient and needs-based action on loss and damage to support the most marginalized people. And then parties need to establish a process and scale of funding. All three of our speakers today talked about the funding of loss and damage, and that's really the case for reparations. Folks are not going to be able to bounce back if they are dealing with being impacted every day. There's no way mitigation and adaptation can happen. And then finally, really helping support subnational level entities, like you were discussing too, to be able to help with that. I guess my first question that I wanted to ask all the speakers is, are there other things that you are hoping either the US government or developed nations will be doing when it comes to loss and damage to be able to help support people? Miriam, I know you identified a couple examples, but are there any others that folks would like to mention? Yeah, Miriam, go ahead.
I hope I really understood your question.
Okay.
Yeah, in terms of solutions, I think I would like to emphasize the issue of recognizing local initiatives that have proved to work. Why there are numerous initiatives that communities have been able to initiate at individual level, at community level, linked to their rich and historical experiences within their indigenous knowledge, linked to their indigenous knowledge. Now, the investment in such initiatives to scale is not only sustainable, but also we at least there's surety and demonstrated evidence that these initiatives have worked, and therefore bringing them to scale would be a point to begin at. The other that is very critical is investment in infrastructure, like climate information, to ensure that it comes in timely, it comes in accurately, to ensure that individuals' decisions can be made at all levels. Farmers can be able to plant within time. Farmers can be able to not to plant. Just as an example, to plant to avoid losses that may happen. Resources, information can also help at structure level. To say, I can give an example of transport infrastructure that is now being lost simply because there's no information, scientific information to say at this time we shall have huge volumes of water. In that case, we need to put up structures that, in this form. So such information and continuously supporting such capacity. I would like to underscore continuously. Why? Because you realize that climate change is not static. The effects are not static. They keep on happening over and over again. Sometimes we may not be able to predict, sometimes we may be able to predict, but the continuity and insistence on capacity building and financing for that matter is in one way or the other, partly going to help communities, partly going to help individuals to be able to prepare in good time for the future that is unknown. I can leave it at that.
Okay, thank you. Would any of you like to comment? Yeah, Kathy.
Yeah, well, Natalie, I'm going to say that I think we recognize that there is no one-size-fits-all approach. And it's important that we carefully assess current and projected loss and damage and identify the scale of the challenge confronting each impacted country. That's going to be very important. We just need a very comprehensive approach to loss and damage, identify ongoing responses to address loss and damage. And we can ascertain the specific contributions or targets on loss and damage. But to do this, we're going to need data and information, research. We're going to need to provide technology, capacity building, There are a lot of ways that we can address loss and damage, but you know, it begins with finance. And I think it begins, first of all, with taking responsibility and being accountable. And that means finance. And unfortunately, that is what the countries who have contributed most to loss and damage are failing to do. Just since we've been here, we have heard every conceivable solution under the sun. We've heard all of these promises, which I think are idle because none of the promises made. Everybody's patting themselves on the back, but there is nothing with any type of accountability to it. And, you know, that's just a gigantic failure. And, you know, we've been fooled before, and people are questioning why the anger and why the skepticism is because we've been here before. And I can tell you that I know not only are the people in the Gulf South, where I live, sick and tired of being sacrificed on, but I think the people across the nation are sick and tired of being the sacrifice zone.
Thanks, Kathy.
Yeah, you know, and I just want to echo what Kathy has said and what she has said that you know we need money. Like we just need more money, right? Like we're living in this capitalistic world, and we're talking about money. Money is the root of all evil, but it also we need actual money to be in there. And I think that it is important for us to really pressure our fellow civil society on understanding what loss and damage actually is. We need to like normalize what this means on the world stage as Americans to really push these sort of things. And you know, something that my colleague here talked about is amplifying the Indigenous knowledge. You know, I was just in London on my way up here to Glasgow. I went to the Natural History Museum, and inside they were suggesting that bison, buffalo, that are indigenous to Europe would be a carbon sequestration thing. This is a nature-based solution, saying that we would just bring the buffalo back, right? As a Native American, I find this really tasteless in my mouth. It feels disgusting in my mouth, even to speak this. And when I hear about, you know, these nature-based solutions and all of this indigenous perspectives, like we have a relationship, I think, universally as indigenous people to live in harmony with the land. You know, from our perspective, I can only speak from my tribe's perspective, but we are an extension of the planetary consciousness. And when we fight for protection of the land, water, and air, we are fighting for protection of ourselves. And when we talk about amplifying the stuff that has been worked, we need to find stuff that's happening globally. And when we look at the forest fires and drought and all of these buckets of issues that affect multiple nations globally, we need to start unifying and really push what's been working and amplify and give money to those grassroots groups that are out there in every single country doing the work that we need to do in order to amplify help, both social justice aspects and environmental protection that unify. This is the only way forward, and we need money. We need much more money than what is pledged, and we need physical money to be inside of the bank accounts for this mechanism.
Thank you, Jacob. I'd like to open it up to the floor if any of you have any questions for our panelists. There are 4 mics around the room, 2 up front if you see this, and then 2 in the back. I just wanted to start opening it up in case anybody has any questions that they would like to ask our folks. Feel free to start moving there, and then I can call on you if and when you're ready, if you would like to. Until we have an audience question, I can just continue with some of the questions that were raised in my head while we were starting to have this conversation. And really thinking about like what this financial institute, one thing I'd like to talk about a little bit more now that you brought this up is a lot of these big financial mechanisms and multi-development banks or multinational development banks, apologies, we're talking about like the Green Climate Fund, we're talking about the Green Environment Facility, we're talking about the World Bank. All of these banks have huge pockets of money and really limited ways to actually get it to the ground and actually make sure that grassroots groups are getting it. And so it ends up going to either large organizations or large entities or more governments that are not actually funneling it down to the people that need it. And so I was wondering if any of you could comment on any ideas you have for making sure that the money gets to where it's supposed to be, because it is hard to manage a giant pool of money. How do you decide which applications get it? Some only need a couple thousand here or there, some need more. Like, how do we make sure that grassroots are really getting the tools and resources they need? Yeah, would you like to start, Miriam?
Yeah, sure. Thank you, Natalie. First of all, before responding, I would like to emphasize the fact that luckily there's a growing body of evidence that that speaks to what is the volume of resources in terms of finances required for loss and damage, at least for less developed countries. It's some information that we can relate to, and I think in as much as making a case for loss and damage financing, there's a point at which we can begin from. The other is that what is very critical for making sure that the communities that are located on the last mile or on the front lines of the effects of climate change actually receive those resources is having them involved all the way around. We come to such spaces and speak about climate financing, and the people that we claim to be talking on behalf of them, for them, and yet those people are there. We also have the assumption that these people are on the end recipients of the discussion that we always make, or are on the recipient end of solutions that we tend to come up from such discussions. And yet these people have been able to initiate nature-based solutions. Communities are already moving. While there's a lot of talk happening at different levels, especially top-line level, a lot of issues, a lot of action is happening on the front lines. And I would like to emphasize the fact that for us to be able to see impact, positive impact and results from the investments that we keep on claiming to put forward, I think it's high time we have the people that are affected, that are involved, for whom we talk, to get on the tables, to explain to us this is what is happening, and this has worked, and we could do things this way. So instead of leaving them behind, I think we should be able to borrow from the popular, the in-house statement that we usually use, leaving no one behind. I submit.
Thanks. Yeah, I also think it's about learning to grow. Like, the communities may not be saying that the government is doing everything right, and like there may be issues that need to be addressed, but there should be space to allow that and be okay with being wrong so that governments can be accountable to their people. Would anyone else like to comment on the question? And then I'll go to microphone number 3.
Yeah, sure. I just want to say that it's not that difficult, Natalie. Again, this is one of the things where they're making it difficult. They know who the boots on the ground are. They know who the outspoken people are. They know where the frontline communities are located. They know the leadership. So it's not that difficult. You know, you just have to have a willingness to get the money to those communities that's already doing the work. And, you know, we continue to kind of have this trickle down where the larger organizations are getting funded or much better funded, and the people who are actually having to deal with the work on a day-to-day basis, we don't have the luxury. You know, when I get up every day, I'm dealing with issues that my communities have to deal with, as I mentioned earlier, because we're living across the fence line from environmental degradation, and this same community, the same communities that's been impacted most by climate change are being impacted by the false solutions as well. And so we know where those communities are, and we need to fund those communities.
Thank you. Okay, we'll go to microphone number 3 for a question. Thank you.
Thank you, Chair, and it's really helpful to hear each and every one of your testimonies about what's happening directly, the impact on the ground and how much loss and damage will become an increasing factor as time moves forward. My name's Chris Law and I'm a Member of Parliament for the UK, but my government is the subnational government here in Scotland. And I'm proud to say that in terms of climate justice, I'm the climate justice spokesperson for the party. And we also have a climate justice centre here in Glasgow at Caledonia University. I guess my question is going to be around some of the policies that have come forward from the Scottish Government. 12 years ago, we set up the Climate Justice Fund, and that was in partnership with Malawi and Zambia at that time. And it was a small fund. It was £3 million per year, and it just got doubled this year. But part of that Climate Justice Fund this year, and it was announced at COP on Monday, was particularly for climate justice. And it's called the Climate Justice Resilient Fund. Now, the money involved, and the point you made very clearly, is that we need an awful lot more money. The money that we are investing as a subnational government is very small. It's only £1 million per year. But it's the world's first policy. And my question, I guess, is, particularly for those representing the US, will you take lessons from this policy? We're learning here in Scotland. We want to be part of that change, and that's why we've established it. And obviously, at some point in the future, if Scotland becomes independent, we'd hope that fund would grow rather rapidly. But will you be taking that model of that policy and also the facilities of the centre here at Caledonia University? I think there's over 1,000 peer-reviewed papers on climate justice, back to your own nation and lobbying your congressmen and your senators to make sure that they listen and maybe take that step forward. Because for a small nation like Scotland, we aim to lead on these policies, but we do not have the financing where the US does.
Thank you. I'm going to give it over to my colleagues if you want to answer first. I also have an answer, but I don't want to do that.
Yeah, I think that all of us, all we do is advocate. Whenever we get a chance to meet with any elected official, the first thing that we do is say, the reason I'm here is because of. And I applaud the Scottish Government for pushing for such a strong, aggressive thing, especially being, the way things are. I think that it's great for us to move forward together and use that model as something that's already out, but thinking more about how we can contribute on a massive scale to the larger world mechanism. And and £3 million is a lot of money to some people, but not to a country. And I think one of the things that is, I think, common within the UK and America is the immigration policy. The UK and America are afraid of immigrants coming in, and a lot of these immigration and all these stricter and stronger immigration policies are a direct result of climate catastrophe. And a lot of these people that are coming from third world countries have no other option but to try to emigrate into these countries that are doing well. And I think it's a necessary thing for us to really push that. You can either put money into this fund now, or you can deal with the ramifications of just a surge of climate refugees coming to our borders and really pushing it from that. And I'd love to hear later on about how you were able to do that so that we can bring that power back to the States. Thank you.
I also quickly, if that's okay, want to touch on accountability. I think one of the things that the U.S. is scared of is taking on the accountability for what it has done and how much it's really contributed to climate change. And I think that's one of the biggest problems too. They're so worried about what it would cost if they admitted it that they don't want to, and that makes it really hard to even have the conversation. So this is really the first conference that loss and damage is really being discussed by the United States in a serious way. We were honestly lucky to get it in Paris, and that's probably just because they wanted the Paris Agreement to succeed before Obama was out. But had that not been in there, the US has been bad on loss and damage, and that's part of the reason why we wanted to hold this event, was just to make sure that we are having this discussion in a really public way so that we can all put pressure to really make sure that the large countries that have the moral obligation are doing our job. Any other folks want to comment? Otherwise, I'll go to microphone number 2.
Go to the microphone.
Okay. Would you like to ask your question? Thanks.
Yes, so my name's Victoria and I work for a children's rights charity in London, and I don't know if it's really a question or really kind of more of a comment.
That's fine.
I'm quite excited to be in this conversation and hear exactly what you've got to say, because this is the first time in the whole time I've been in the conference for the last 3 days that I've heard anybody talk about Indigenous and local populations actually holding the power, and that being on the stage rather than off the stage or not affiliated to a UN organization. In this whole time as well, I've not seen any conversations talking about how did climate change actually start. I've not heard anyone talk about the Industrial Revolution in any way, shape or form, or anyone talk about biodiversity before colonialism and before anyone was taking over anything, apart from coming into this conversation where I can kind of hear it between the lines, because I know you know what you're talking about. So I just wanted to say a big thank you for that, and what is a big shame is that the room is so kind of empty compared to all of the other spaces. I think the word reparations, even when we mention it with regards to outside climate change, everyone immediately freezes up. So yeah, it's quite interesting, a dialogue, and it's something that I would like to hopefully keep in touch with everyone and see what we can do to push that agenda forward. So I just wanted to say a big thank you for bringing this issue here. And is there anything that maybe we can do with regards to this conference, because there's 20, 30,000 people and it's not being acknowledged where the problem started. So I just wondered if you had any ideas for action after we leave with regards to addressing the narrative that has come out of the conference.
Great. Would anyone like to start with that? Kathy, it looks
Yeah,
like. Okay.
I'm just going to say that the R word is very scary. You know, people, when I say the R word, I mean reparation. People just simply do not want to take responsibility. And that's, I think that's the root of the problem. We know who the culprits are. The science doesn't lie. You know, we know and they know who they are. And they know the damage that's been caused. And it's a human rights crisis. And I think as Jacob mentioned, the climate migration, you know, we can pay now, but it's going to cost us a lot more to pay later. Sooner or later, we're going to have to pay. So we might as well pay on the front end. And I'd certainly like to talk with the gentleman from Scotland before I leave, because I think we could learn a lot. And there are some other injustices and concerns that I have that deal with the UK and the energy transformation or the energy transition. But I think it's very important for us to acknowledge, you know, and that's the whole thing. And like you say, that's probably why you have an empty audience, is because people are so afraid of the word reparations.
Yeah. Would anyone else like? Yeah, go ahead, Miriam.
I wanted to thank you for highlighting and appreciating the space. I would like to also comment more on the issue of information and you know, trying to talk about these issues, right, like you rightly put it, where climate change began from. I think it's not something that really happens on a daily or normally when it comes to such spaces, and it's still a challenge getting back to back to our communities, the issue of awareness about climate change. Sometimes it becomes very difficult for one to engage, for example, with communities, because the first question usually is, what is climate change? And you know, like I said earlier, the issue and the discourse of climate change has been complicated. I don't know whether on purpose, but again, I think moving forward, we need to keep on demystifying, breaking down the issues of climate change, and you know, bringing it nearer to the appreciation of the people that are actually in the middle and at the fore of the effects of climate change. Because why do we have to do that? It's because them even having the basics of information, basics of, like she says, where did this thing come from? It can give them the leverage to relate to it and also relate their daily actions. conscious or unconscious that they are making to adapt and to mitigate to the effects of climate change. And of course, information is power, and as much as communities, whether rural or urban or otherwise, as much as that information is there, I think it's one step into the right direction in terms of making sure that we ensure resilience at least at the lowest level of our being, of our communities. Yeah.
Thank you, Marianne. Yeah, go ahead, Jacob.
Yeah, when we, I 100% agree. In the U.S., when we talk about reparations, it's a scary thing because of all the horrible things that America has done historically, including being the #1 contributor to greenhouse gas emissions in the entire world. All right, this is something that just goes hand in hand. As a Native American, I support our black sisters and brothers for their fight for reparations as we have a solidarity fight for our land back. That's a real thing. And when you see black and brown people standing together to fight for justice and to fight for equality, it scares the white supremacist power structures that are in our administration right now. And all forms of government was built upon colonialism, which is basis of white supremacy. And it's until we start to see each other as equals, as human beings, outside of our own individual outside appearances, but also nations, and seeing that the human factor is that there are children that are being hurt because of what has happened and what we have done. There are older people who are dying because of the things that we have done. The U.S. military is the largest polluter in the entire world, right? And we just accept this. When Joe Biden is talking about the NDCs and going green by 2030, he's not talking about the military. The militaries have been completely left out of the NDCs, and when we talk about that, we just hear empty words. And when we talk about reparations, we need actual action. We need these things. And the brothers and sisters who are suffering at the hands of this impending climate collapse is really important. We need to be pressuring everyone, because this is not an American problem. This is a global problem. This is a human problem that we need to unify for. And so when we fight for reparations, we fight for everyone. I think it's important for us to stand in solidarity and remember that everything is connected, and we are humanity fighting for ourselves. Thank you.
Thanks. Yeah, and as the only white person besides Senator Markey who had to leave on this panel, I will say one thing for me that's been really important is using power and privilege that I have in spaces to be able to lean on others to start amplifying what our black and brown friends are asking for. And it's uncomfortable, and people don't want to talk about it. And that's part of the problem. No one out there wants to talk about it. So that's why we need to be having these conversations and asking questions during all the pavilion events, and when we're talking to our folks and when we're talking to our negotiators. This has to consistently come up like a drumbeat, or it's never gonna get addressed. They don't do anything unless they're scared, and they don't move unless it's a squeaky wheel or a big problem. And so, we intentionally named this session with reparations in it because we know that it's hard to talk about it, but this is seriously what we need to do in order to hold our country and other developed nations accountable. We need to do our fair share of to be able to actually address the situation. And so that is really, that's really where USCAN as a network is coming from. And I didn't actually give that much background on USCAN. So the US Climate Action Network is part of Climate Action Network International, which is where Mary and I met. But basically, it's an entity of US NGOs, and we've been really intentionally centering justice. And how do we actually make sure that the people who are taking up space, who are in the rooms, are actually the people of the communities? And that's intentional and hard to do because white people will take power when they can too. Yeah, so it's something that we have to all work on. Does anyone else from the audience have any questions, or does anyone else want to make any other comments?
Yeah, I'd just like to echo some of the stuff that we're talking about with the U.S. Climate Action Network. Our U.S. Climate Action Network, we understand that all this stuff happening, but within the network itself has been derived an adult version of Sunrise, where we're trying to mobilize American citizens to, have our government succeed to the demands of the climate crisis. And I think it's important for us to stand arm in arm together when we fight for social justice and thinking about that underneath the lens of environmental justice. You know, we have a big brain trust where we all got together and we thought about how could we, as Americans, try to mobilize everyone to save the future. And one of the key things, I think the key components that everybody has agreed on is that we must focus on social justice and social and economic environmental justice as being the catalyst for solving the climate crisis. And I think it's really important for us as American citizens to understand that we cannot have environmental justice without climate justice, without racial justice. All of these things are interconnected, and we only have each other to hold each other up.
And Natalie, I'll say that basically it comes down to morality. And unfortunately, you know, countries lack the morality to be responsible. You know, countries lack the morality, as Jacob mentioned. We don't recognize racism. And countries, unfortunately, still if you look at the faces in those who are most impacted by climate injustices, they're communities of color. And so our communities are considered dispensable. And that's very unfortunate because that's where the issue of morality comes in.
Thank you, Kathy. Oh, yes, go ahead, Miriam, and then we'll go to number 2.
Yes, right. I think my comment to that is that I think when you talk about climate justice, there's a point at which we begin to do so. The convention that brings us all here is very clear. The issue of intergenerational equity, the issue of the principle, not the issue, the principle of similar and differentiated responsibility still holds in as much as we come here to chart ways forward into climate action, or rather addressing the effects of climate change. So from that point, my last shot on that would be that if we talk about intergenerational equity, it gets us back to one thinking. Because of the effects of climate change, the children and the young people in my community have not had the opportunity or the privilege to live life the way it used to be. Why? Because I can give an example. In my community, there are bird species that used to live, and people used to cherish them in my community. Then, today, we tell those stories as if we are talking about history. And you know, it has what is happening and the human activities, particularly industrialization as it has been put forward by science, can be linked to such a scenario where birds are almost getting to extinction. And you know, it connects in those small dots, for which are usually neglected and yet very critical. If children cannot have the right to play or right to an environment that is sustainable and good, then I think when we talk about addressing climate change and making sure that all efforts put forward should be able to address such issues. So the issue of rights is very central, should be central when it comes to addressing climate change. And like she said, we need to put a human face to whatever actions, whatever solutions, whatever areas of whatever actions, decisions made out of these rooms should put a human face to them.
Thank you. Yeah. Okay, we have about 5 minutes left, so we'll take your question as last. Thank you very much.
Sure. I'll try to make it quick, but firstly, just want to echo everything else everyone has said in terms of thank you. I found this incredibly insightful and useful, and I'm putting down the audience numbers to the wet, rain, and the fact that it's a Saturday, and not much more.
I think so too.
But yeah, also just a huge thanks on top for being the first event in 6 days that has used the word race. So I think, you know, it's really easy to keep that conversation out of climate change. So you guys have been the first event that has actually, you know, in any way, subtly or more overtly have spoken about race. So thank you for that. I'm a civil servant. I work quite closely with negotiators, and actually my negotiator colleagues are the ones that pointed to this event today and said this one actually looks really interesting, but they're all stuck in rooms, and was like, you know, no worry, I will be there, and I'll report back anything that I find really useful, and everything has been incredibly useful. And working closely with negotiators, I think I've seen kind of their influence, but also the limitations as civil servants as well, because of political landscape, the governments represent, and so on. I myself, I work on gender responsive policy, and I've, you know, had a lot of doors slammed in my face as well, just kind of getting the conversation going. And I think my question overall is, what does it take, or what will it take to actually get loss and damage and other things that we've spoken about today in terms of like gender responsive finance, understanding race, what will it take to get that really at the top of the agenda for people? Is it the fact that we need the US to come forward and take it more seriously and others will follow? Is it that we won't have much hope if they don't, and everyone else will just have to sit, because if the US doesn't move, not many other people will move? And just a really bleak question to sum it all up, if you guys are hopeful that it will actually move, the conversation will shift to take loss and damage and all these things to the top of the agenda. Thanks.
Thank you. Who would like to take that question first? Go ahead, Jacob.
Go, Jacob.
Yeah, I was just looking at somebody else, actually. I wasn't.
Oh, you were looking. Okay. Kathy, would you like?
Well, I'll say absolutely. The U.S. Can be extremely influential. The U.S., it's obvious. We know that we're responsible for the cumulative emissions, and we just don't want to take the responsibility. We don't want to take responsibility for anything, all the injustices from the founding of America, which was stolen from our Indigenous brothers and sisters, to the racism and the slavery abuse, human rights abuse as it relates to slaves who built the country. And until, you know, we can reckon with all of the injustices and all of the immoralities that's faced our country, until we can stand for that and take responsibility, climate justice is just going to be another issue that'll continue to be pushed to the side.
Thank you. I will say that I think you create your own political realities. And I know that sounds really odd, but if like you have people working on inside and outside, you have the rebels and you have the people who are consistently beating the drum inside to be able to push the conversation forward. Like loss and damage, when it had been talked by the US like even 4 or 5 years ago, and now they're actually having substantive conversations. I'm not saying that we're moving quick enough, but that's something that we could consider. So I would just consider those who are in rebel roles continue to push, and those who are inside roles really keep doing that too. We have about 20 seconds. Does anyone have any final comments? I think Jacob, you did.
Yeah, sorry. So just to reach back to what you were saying, you know, I think it's important for us to normalize the term loss and damage. You know, the reparations, the word itself has a lot of like heavy weight to it. But when we talk about loss and damage specifically, we need to be able to understand it fully and 100% and be able to disseminate that information. As an American citizen coming into this space, I had no idea about any of these processes and how complicated they are. And so I think it is important for us as civil society to really explain it like you would be explaining it to a 5-year-old, like why this is important. And really there needs to be an information campaign where people are educated and get woke to what is really taking place and the major role that the U.S. has in the world scene, specifically by being against things, not being for things. So, you know, when we think about that into the context, it's our job and it's our responsibility, our moral obligation to hold our representatives accountable for this.
Thank you. Thanks, everyone. This has been a really great panel. I just want to thank these panelists. Some of them just found out about this today because the rain and the trains. So I just want to thank everyone for coming, and I hope you have a great day. And if we could give a round of applause to our panelists, that would be great.
Thank you.
Thank you.